proven approaches to social from big brands. You've heard what's worked, what hasn't worked, what some of the legal implications are, how do you do different activities with social. What I'm going to try and do is bring this all together into a framework that Altimeter has been working on in our social research for a little while now, sort of things that we've gathered from the market that really seem to work. Can you all hear me too? All right. And I've got a wireless mic, so I can always come by and find the people who are sleeping and try and scare them. But I want to give you sort of 3 takeaways today, or takeaways in 3 steps. Number 1, how do you get ready internally? So with all this great advice, what's the structure supposed to look like? And I'm going to try and give you a model that we think is nearly foolproof in terms of how it should look inside your organization when you organize around social. And then I want to get into what are the objectives? How do you measure your success? How do you understand where you are in your social journey and where you need to go? And then I'll wrap up with some key takeaways. So getting ready internally is maybe something that folks have started. Maybe it's something that you're new into the role, so you're just looking at doing. Maybe you've inherited this and it was underfunded or pet project, which often is the case. And you're trying to figure out how do you either redesign or from scratch design from the ground up your social strategy. And just to get a sense, how many folks are sort of at that, you feel like you're at that point. You're about to jump in. You really haven't done this yet at a company-wide level. All right, so oddly, about half the room on this side. So this is good, though. This is a key place to be in terms of how you decide where you're going to go with social as a career path, and then how that informs how your organization is going to take on social as a business objective. So we mapped this out, and I apologize because actually sitting back there earlier I could tell these are a little hard to see, but what you have here on the left-hand side is sort of the level of need or the level of engagement with social inside your organization. And it starts out very low with awakening. The organization says, hey, this is something we should do. Or more often than not, an executive says, hey, I don't know anything about this, go figure it out, it's something we should do. And you crest from there and you get into the ascension of the strategist. Somebody, probably one of you, or many of you, are anointed as the social person, the social strategist. Maybe you get strategist in the title, maybe you don't. Depends maybe how enlightened the organization is. But very quickly, the sort of importance or the demands of social media by both internal business constituents and customers outside start weighing you down. And that's sort of where you see this dip here. You get to point number 3 where there's a storm of, what we call a storm of cultural conflict. So a lot of different maybe areas of the business are coming on board and saying, hey, we want to be part of this too, or customers start gravitating toward this, and it very quickly becomes very hard to scale and do this well across the entire organization. Which brings you to number 4. This is a decision point. You can either reach escape velocity, and I'll give you some very explicit pointers on how we think the best ways are to accomplish that, or you can end up being relegated to what we call social media sanitation. I think you can guess both by the graphic and the names which one you want to be on, but it is important to think about this as it is a real turning point. And even if you're down here at step 1, it's really important to think about all the things that are happening both strategically and from a day-to-day that are going to lead you to this point where you really have to decide, do you want to sink or do you want to swim? So grounded to social media help desk or grounded to social media sanitation is how we refer to the first path, the one that sort of goes down, and then achieving escape velocity with scalable programs is path number 2. I want to start with grounded to social media sanitation. Let's figure out what it is that Altimeter has seen that doesn't work, and how do you avoid that? What are the symptoms of that situation, and how can you find a way to navigate around it? Number 1, and this is data that actually goes back to 2010, so this is probably a much different picture today, but it is interesting to think about where we were, because one of the first things we'll ask a client is, what does your program look like? Is it proactive or is it reactive? 59%, and this is again back in 2010, said we are proactive. We're getting ahead of requests from stakeholders. This is great. I can tell you that this pie chart shifts the complete opposite way as companies that are just starting out or were just starting out start going down their journey. They're proactive. They're on top of it. This is great. They're having dialogue. That proactivity quickly falls apart if they're on the wrong path and they're on that path toward the social media help desk. Most of the programs that are out there are pretty young. Again, this is data that's a year and a half old, but we were seeing very few programs that were 5 years old. And actually, when you start digging into that data around, well, a 5-year-old social media program, what does that look like? I mean, that could be a single CEO blog that had comments on it, and very recently has turned into the tools that we think of today, things like Twitter, things like Facebook presences, and definitely not taking on those things at a more granular brand or property level, depending on the type of business that you are. The annual budget across all the different types of corporations, from under $250 million to $10 billion or more, the average was $833,000. Now, I'm sure there's a good number of folks in the room who would love to have $833,000 to throw at social, but this is an average, and as you can see, there's a big overhang of large organizations that are throwing money at this, many times because they're spending that money in a duplicative fashion. They may have multiple programs. If they're not on the right path, they're going to have multiple programs that are duplicating efforts. They might have multiple programs that are completely out of sync among different brands or different product groups, or even through acquisitions that they've made. So that money being spent doesn't necessarily equate to a quality program, and we've seen social media gaffes and social media help desk type situations at large companies and small. So nobody's really immune to this. It's a situation that many organizations, many professionals, people who are seasoned in the field can often find themselves in, based on the resources that they're given, based on the strategy that their organization wants to take. So this is an interesting one. Customers becoming accustomed to yelling in public. And actually, when Elizabeth was talking earlier, I don't know how many of you were in her session from Four Seasons. There is a lot of really great and really interesting things that Four Seasons is doing, and I'm actually going to call them out throughout this because I think their strategy mirrors the path we think organizations should be on. But there was a phrase, and if Elizabeth is here, I don't want to misparaphrase, but I think it was turning the glitch around, or glitch avoidance. And some of the examples were people staying at a property having a very bad experience, and instead of picking up the phone and calling the front desk, which at least 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, that's what we all would have thought to do, they were tweeting about it. And one of the examples she shared was from a pretty well-known social media maven who had a good number of followers, saying the turn-down service in my room was terrible. I think she equated the music to something that would have been appropriate for a funeral or a beheading. Ouch. That is not something you want a customer who has a huge influence saying to a large number of people. So they got on it, turned it around. Next day, I think there was a personalized note, and they made the situation right. That's great, and it's amazing to see an organization of that size, they're not the largest hotel chain, but a fairly large and fairly influential brand, able to do that. But if you're just thinking of the end result of, I need to turn this around, that's not going to scale. Another way that things quickly can grow out of hand is that you have business units that jump on the bandwagon. They see the success that a business unit or a product group had with social and say, well, we want to do that too. Guess who gets the phone call? Probably one of you. And guess who continues to get the phone call as this stuff gets more and more popular? It's pretty quickly evident that you're not going to be able to scale out your advice, your best practices, if you're literally one person or even one small group that's not empowered to take this on at a company level. Because resources are limited, there's only so much you can do. The dialogue can't scale one-to-one. So my point about Four Seasons is not that, wow, this was an immature way to take this on. It was actually a very thoughtful way to take it on based on a structure that was there to support that type of one-on-one interaction. One-on-one interaction itself can't scale. My own personal experience with this, just this last week, releasing a report, I've got colleagues like my colleague Jeremiah Aoyang, who was here last year, many more Twitter followers, far less handsome. He tweeted the report out to his followers, and I very quickly found that even my own personal brand, social media, couldn't scale. And if it's not going to scale for me, it's not going to scale for some of the Fortune 5s that I see out in the audience today. And fragmented efforts have a whole slew of repercussions for the brand and for the organization that really just you want to avoid. And obviously demands that compound, and with a sort of logarithmic curve, you're going to find that your ability to serve and make positive these social endeavors by other people in the organization it's not going to be something you're going to be able to follow through on. So, net, companies headed to social media sanitation are simply not going to scale, and if they're not going to scale, they're not going to succeed. So how do you achieve escape velocity? You want to figure out a way to harness the goodness that was the reason social media became popular inside the organization. You want to harness the good experiences that you can provide your customers or your people in your supply chain with social media. And it really comes down to organizational structure and organizational behavior and conditioning. So these are the 5 different ways that we see social organized inside of organizations. The one on the left, not surprisingly, those are the companies that tend to find themselves in the social media help desk. It's a decentralized effort. And let's be honest, this is the way that social came into most organizations. This is not, in most cases, a technology or an area of technology that a CEO woke up one day and said, we need to strategize around this. Because many few disruptive technologies that are worth their while come about that way. We see some organizations take a centralized approach, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then on the right-hand side, we start moving to the more mature models that actually help these organizations achieve escape velocity and do this right and do this at a scale that can serve everybody in the organization and all the organization's customers. But the decentralized approach or the decentralized result is a symptom of things that are organic. These are often very authentic. You know, you're talking to Joe, the guy who is the engineer who programmed your device, and he can actually solve your problem, which is great. Or you're talking to Mary, who designed the sweater that you're wearing that is tearing apart at the seams. Joe and Mary are never going to be able to keep up with a successful business and a successful dialogue among all their customers. And also, this is an uncoordinated effort. Some of the research that we've done in social has looked at social media disasters. And by the way, all of our research, if you go to Altimeter Group, it's there. It's fully available. It's free to download. So as I reference this, know that it's there for you to take, and that's what we want to make it available as. We've seen some really bad social media gaffes, many times perpetrated by people at the C-level or in the C-level suite. Because they probably are the last ones to come around even when we do get things centralized or standardized. But it can do massive damage to the brand in 140 characters, and you just don't want that to happen. An example of an organization that we've seen trying to promote this type of branding is Sun. I don't know how much that's changed, to be honest, since the takeover of the organization, but this is the direction that Sun was going. Centralized is great in some ways in that you've got one department that controls all efforts. This is sort of the PR-controlled social media machine that takes a very similar look to the way advertising is taken on. Everything has a very common look, a very common theme to it. Everything's approved, everything's in sync. That doesn't play so well in social media because it's not authentic. If I'm starting to see employees of my local McDonald's tweeting, "I'm loving it," that's not probably a phrase they want to ever hear again, let alone use in their daily life. That's not authentic to me. And an example here that we see that's had some trouble with this is Ford. So hub and spoke, and actually touching back on the Four Seasons example, Elizabeth mentioned that they're in or she at least used graphics that intimated that they're in a hub and spoke model. I think they're actually a little bit more advanced than that, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But the hub and spoke model works really well because you've got one central person or more likely department setting an agenda, and then allowing different business units, different properties, again, different subsets of the business execute on that agenda. So it's similar in the control and the sort of guaranteed quality of the content that's going out to a centralized model, but you're able to give different business units, different people their own spin, their own way to personalize this and make it genuine. This also takes a lot of time, especially if you're talking about a brand crisis, if you're talking about a new product launch. The ability to coordinate and move quickly at the speed of social media, something that is set up in this type of environment, might take a little bit of time, number one, to set up, and it might take a little bit of time for messages to flow through that machine that ultimately gets built. But we've seen some good examples here of companies like Red Cross, or brands like Red Cross, I should say, doing this. Multiple hub and spoke, or the Dandelion model, is where you've got multiple different brands, you've got multiple different product lines, and there's sort of one gospel of information that's then being filtered out and parsed out to the different business units. This is really a matter of scale from an organizational standpoint, and that's the main difference you see between the single hub and spoke and the multiple hub and spoke. It makes sense for General Motors to have multiple hub and spokes for their different automotive brands, let alone the different subsets within those brands. There are strata of products that need to be addressed genuinely and need to be addressed by their own teams. There's simply no way to scale even a single hub and spoke in those large organizations. And an example here is HP. So this one to me is interesting. This we call the Honeycomb. And this is where you see every employee being empowered. And the reason I was saying that the Four Seasons example to me is a little bit more mature or a little bit more advanced than a single hub and spoke or even a multiple hub and spoke comes down to a phrase that was used in that presentation. And again, for those of you who didn't get to sit through it, it's really just sort of an amazing case study of how an organization has grasped social media to give itself a personality. And one of the phrases that Elizabeth used was, "That's so Four Seasons." And I don't know if this is a common phrase that's used in the organization, but this idea that people live the brand or act the brand in things that they do, in interactions that they have. I think she cited something like 5,000 interactions in a hotel take place between guests and staff every day. And you can see it in a place this scale. I think 5 people said hello to me down the hallway before I even made it to the elevator. There's a lot of people to control, but if you can do this in a way where everybody is on message and everybody is putting a little bit of their personality, but a lot more of the brand personality forth, and of course they know what that is, you can have an extremely powerful, extremely personalized, what looks to be very organic model to your customers. And this is just, it's rare, first of all, but the brands that do this are brands that have lived and put forth some very advanced thinking in terms of how they do business, Zappos being the one that stands out to me. We've also seen this from Dell, from Intel, and from Best Buy. So when we look at what are the organizations that we've talked to, which bucket do they fall into, most of them fall into hub and spoke, which is good. If I were to rate this on a sort of a scale of, a grading scale, I think that means we're probably at like a B-, maybe a C+ in terms of where organizations have been. If we did the same data and took it back maybe 3 years, I think that whole entire list would shift, those percentages would shift to the left-hand side. If you break this down by company size, you'll see a little bit larger group in the multiple hub and spoke. I think it should be even a little bit larger. But holistic, 1.4%. That is really, really hard to do. And it's not to say that that's the way you have to actually approach social media. That is the rare gift of a company that has really gotten its brand nailed down, that they can accomplish that. And I think, honestly, what you should aspire to is the hub and spoke or multiple hub and spoke model inside your organization. So how do you do that? Becoming an enabler of business units is step number 1. And this really depends on having the center of that hub being the center of excellence for social media. This means that the social strategy is there. What are the outlets and how much are you going to focus on each one? Training and education. I think it was this morning's data that was being shown by the GSMI folks that showed a lot of the folks basically felt that the boss doesn't know about it or the boss doesn't get it. This has to be bidirectional. The training and education needs to move up the chain and down the chain. And actually, more often than not, it's going to be a bottom-up effort. There need to be policies, and they need to involve the legal team. Some of these gaffes that I talked about that happened at the C-level, like I said, had really damaging impacts to the brand. There needs to be an okay list and a no list of either topics or views that can and cannot be expressed. That's a delicate line because you don't want to get back to that command and control structure that we talked about. What are the research initiatives that are going on? What are your customers looking to do in terms of their interaction? Do they care about Twitter? Probably. Do they care about Pinterest? Increasingly, the answer to that is maybe, depending on your customer base. How do you interact in those different channels? Those research initiatives will lead your high-level social strategy in the right places. Measurement and requirements of accountability. We'll talk a little bit about some ways to measure what's effective and what's not, and how do you determine what effective looks like. And then vendor selection and training. Because these tools that are out there exist, the tools that are out there exist for a reason, even with the best structure, this stuff doesn't scale on a one-to-one model or using free tools, although that is a great place to start. So the Center of Excellence, it works together with the spokes to basically set the tone. The Center of Excellence should be the arbiter of the social media voice, to a certain extent the social media content, and it should be reporting and measuring the social media successes that your business has. Now I know I can see a lot of faces sort of, I can read the thoughts, I think, saying, sounds like a lot of work. A Center of Excellence can still be a group of 2, 3, or 4 people. And I've actually got some examples later on that are some really strong examples from teams that are actually just that size. This does not need to be a Herculean effort of 50, 100, 1,000 people. The spokes have that need to be bidirectional. They should, in addition to managing the efforts that deal with their brand or their product line or the area that they've been tasked with, they should also be feeding back best practices. If you've got a large number of disparate brands, it's entirely possible that in one group or one product set, Pinterest is of extreme interest, whereas in another group, it's all Twitter all the time or it's all Facebook all the time. And again, that bidirectional learning needs to take place not just in a training sense, but also in an information sharing sense. Just some examples here. This is eBay and sort of how they break up the world. This is a global hub and spoke model. This is at sort of the massive level, but they break it up across the geographies, across functions. eBay is a large company. They've got PayPal. They've got a number of different properties, and each one of those properties has to have its own structure. But there is a social media team that rides across all of this. Adobe is another example of a company that's taken on this strategy for social, and I think it actually is indicative of the way that Adobe takes on branding. So for a long time, Adobe was the PDF company to some people, the Photoshop company to designers, the Shockwave Flash company to people who wanted to curse at their web browser. They've got a lot of different brands and a lot of different products, and they've managed as a company to really give a common language to how they look at the world. It's either content creation, content, I'm going to mess this up, but it's content creation, content consumption, and content design, I think are roughly the 3 areas where they place all their products. They understand from a top down what audiences want to consume which products, which ones want to communicate with which products, and they've done this in their social media strategy as well. So what are the objectives? We've talked about how this thing should look. We talked about how this thing looks in some large organizations. Let's talk a little bit about how do you start moving down the path and know where you are and where you should be going. So there's 3 components: learn, dialogue, and advocate. These are the 3 building blocks of any social strategy. So for the folks that were, I think, largely on this side of the room who said, we're just starting out, start thinking about, as I go through each of 3 of these, which ones you've accomplished or are accomplishing, and maybe which ones you haven't. And for those that maybe are thinking about a social strategy that's in good shape, do you have all these elements and the sub-elements that I'm about to talk about? Number 1, learning. It's all about listening, and it's all about learning from customers who are volunteering that information to you. This is a learning opportunity. And I don't think that I've run into many brands that have either gone through a situation and learned from it and kept this thinking, but we're increasingly seeing companies understand that this is a 2-way dialogue, this is a learning experience when social is engaged. It's not a megaphone, it's not a bullhorn, and it's certainly not a sparring ground. There are free tools that are available pretty natively, Google Blog Search, Twitter Search, where you can start automating the process of understanding how do people perceive my brand. And you're going to find different elements from each of the channels that you're searching on, and I know you can't read this. These are 2 examples about Raytheon. On the right-hand side, pretty interesting, Raytheon products, what they're working on, what are their things that they're doing. On the Google Blog Search side, I believe the first example, Raytheon should be in the dock. They are the world's biggest producer of military armament, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Personal opinions, maybe you want to evaluate all of them equally, maybe you want to evaluate some stronger than others. But the idea here is that you're going to find throughout different channels, using these free basic tools, different pockets of brand awareness, brand perception, and start to figure out how you can address them. This is listening. One of the things that came up in one of the sessions earlier was there's no way we can listen to all of the different people that are talking about our brand. Probably true, but if you're Dell, you've made a huge investment in tracking 22,000 plus conversations across the web to take that feedback inside. These are actual pictures from a visit to their social media strategy center in Round Rock, where they have people full-time monitoring this. Sort of like if you've ever been to a carrier network operations center, they are watching spikes in traffic around different trends. They're watching different things that are happening, essentially watching the weather as it pertains to social. And they're taking all this information, and they have a huge apparatus to take that information, put it out through the different spokes of the organization. So it is possible. It's costly, and it requires a lot of executive buy-in, but this is sort of an aspirational goal for how a listening program can look. Another thing is, what is the perception of brand? So there's a company that's out there called NetBase that does brand perception studies. They put these graphs, largely, I think all of them, largely if not all of them, on their website, where you can take a look at different segments of everything from clothing to, this is defense contractors, and I'm not trying to pick on the defense contractors, but who knew they would all end up in the like quadrant, some of them bordering on love. This is a great way to get a sense of how you can monitor what the perception of your brand is. And this is actually a pretty homogeneous one. I've seen many that are in consumer goods or apparel that the brands are all over the map. And it's sort of surprising to see some brands end up where they do. So learning the best practices, start with the free and inexpensive tools. If you're not doing this today, it's a matter of automating a few searches and getting that information processed and out to the right folks in your organization or on your team. Use terms related to your products, especially if you're trying to build executive buy-in. Likes may not be the best guide of how strong your brand is if your CEO or your CFO or whomever you're presenting to doesn't know what Facebook is. This is engagement. This is high probability transactional customers. Whatever your internal terminology is, it should very easily map to social, and you should use that comfortable technology for your organization. Focus on customer pain points. Yes, we want to avoid the reactive going out there and listening to people yelling in the street, but we also want to figure out, is there a weather pattern? You don't need to have that monitoring center that Dell has to make it happen, but is there a weather pattern around your brand, around a given product, around a product issue? This is a great way to find out. And then, you can move forward by using brand monitoring software and services. So NetBase that I just talked about, they obviously aren't in business just to put those free graphics and put them on their site for people to consume. There's a whole business behind that that gets much, much more granular around why those brand perceptions are what they are and tell you what you can do with them. So that's learn. I want to talk about dialogue. Using social to respond and initiate conversations in social channels. So you've listened, you've started to learn, you've got a beat on the pulse of how your brand or your product is perceived. How do you now enter that conversation? And again, realizing that many of you have and have been for a while in the conversation, think of these also as best practices to continue the conversation. This is an interesting example from TSA, who many of us will be seeing later on this afternoon at McCarran Airport. And interestingly enough, they use this blog, the TSA blog. They received more than 41,000 comments. It was the most viewed blog due to many different things that have happened with TSA. The example that's up here, inappropriate note was stuck in somebody's suitcase after it had been searched. They responded to it on the blog. Very quickly used this to jump out and get on top of a crisis. And largely, aside from, if we want to get into arguments of how much time it took and FTE equivalents, this was a free effort for them to get better PR for a pretty big news story that had already started to gain traction. You can also give a face to the company. So here's an example from Boeing, which is a company that most of us maybe sit in their products or use their products regularly, but probably don't think much about what does Boeing look like or what's the personality of Boeing. This was started back in 2005 as an experiment, and just these are engineers kind of geeking out about their planes, and it's really grown into a whole program for Boeing, which brings together not just their customers and their executives, but people who are interested in that general field of aviation. This gives a PR opportunity that didn't exist before because the vehicle wasn't there for Boeing. So dialogue has some specific key performance indicators. I do not expect you to copy these down. They are going to be in the decks that you're going to get. But this gives you a sense of how you can actually calculate share of voice, how engaged your audience is, and what the conversation reach is. And these are really great ways to start saying to your management, to your team itself, this is how effective we are, because you start measuring this today, you can start managing it forward, because you can't manage what you don't measure, and these are pretty simple ways to measure how dialogue is taking shape. So you want to have the right mindset. You've got to get in this and be in this for the long term. This should not be something that's brought on as a pet project or something that's under-resourced. Once you've finished listening and want to get into dialogue, this becomes a full-time job. This becomes something that you have to keep up with. And any one of us in the room that has a blog or that goes on Twitter knows that there's a high degree of drop-off the minute you stop talking in the conversation, pretty much like real life itself. First listen. Definitely first listen. You want to add value to the existing discussions. You don't want to come in and trying to set the conversation or set the tone. That's really going to be a detriment to your genuineness to the market. As this gets more mature in your organization, you want to figure out how the brand trends, how people feel about it, what the topics are, and you can start building up sort of a social editorial calendar that builds on these conversations. So while I say don't jump in and try and define the conversation, over time you can steer the conversation. Again, it's a dialogue. You've seen some great examples with this. Starbucks has been really sort of adept at this. Some of the recent introductions of products like their blonde coffee, I mean, they just sort of slid right in with, hey, we're introducing this, got people talking about it. They've been doing this for a long time. They were able to set that conversation toward a product that many people didn't even know about until they discovered it in a hashtag on Twitter. So there's a learned and practiced way to make this take place. So the last building block is advocate. So you've learned and listened, you've started the dialogue. Now you want to figure out how you can use this platform as a way to advocate for your brand, as a way to amplify what you're trying to say. This is where you really get your bang for your buck in social media. This is where the quote-unquote free activities start to pay dividends. You're now recruiting an army of folks to amplify your brand, and this is something that can happen pre-purchase. This is something that can happen post-purchase, but this is one of the best returns that social can have. So one of the first examples here is actually something that was put together in part by someone in the room. So Kathleen's right up here in front, and her team is roughly 4 people. And this is something where they took advantage not only of the voices that are out there saying, this is who I am, I'm a soldier and this is my story, but a network of battalions that in some cases are 2 people for a square radius of thousands of miles who take those stories, bubble them up through the hubs, through the spokes to the center of excellence and get that message out. This is a government agency. This is an agency facing budget cuts. This is an agency that has grown in terms of technology, which in turn told management, you probably don't need more people because you got more computers. This is a great example of a social program that was built by a small team and is maintained by a small team and has paid great dividends. More blog-related content here. This comes from the United We Serve blog from the National Community Service Outreach. Again, this is something where a blog presence starts listening to the conversation, slowly starts participating, and then inviting members of the community into that conversation to share their stories about why volunteerism is great. I did X, and this is what I got out of it. You've now got people who've already essentially paid blood, sweat, and tears, now paying forward what they've learned in your marketing, empowering your marketing. And there are some key KPIs or key performance indicators here as well, and these deal with how many active advocates do you have? How do you figure that out? What is the influence of the advocates or the advocation that you're doing? And what is the impact? And that one's really interesting to me because you can actually start to think about the conversations that are driven by this idea of advocacy and the total volume of that traffic, and then how does that measure out? What is your multiplier in terms of the traffic or the sales? And again, you can take these at face value or you can tweak them a bit to your business, but what is that advocacy multiplier that social is getting you now that you've started to participate in the conversation, set the tone, and recruit other voices to tell your story? So the best practices, start simple. You want to just simply get the conversation started with, or you want to get the conversation going with topics that you've sort of gleaned from listening, that you've gleaned from those weather patterns in social. You can cultivate ongoing relationships with influencers. I mean, you may find that there are influencers who, at a small level, you have a couple interactions with, and suddenly they're going back and forth about your brand and starting to advocate for you. Four Seasons shared an example of that. BJ Emerson, who spoke at the last GSMI event, was talking about how that happened with his brand Tasty Delight, up to the point where, actually just saw one of his tweets today, their episode of 30 Rock, where they're being featured, is happening. Those things took a long time to build, but that conversation started, and it starts with one or two advocates, and those advocates can ultimately amplify the brand as a whole. You want to invite these people in. You want to invite, I think, the people who are most strongly cheerleading your brand, but you also want to invite in those who are most critical of your brand. Why are they critical? These are people who are consistently expressing an opinion about something, and even if it's something they hate, they're consistently doing it. Might as well have an understanding of why, and you may even be able to shift that conversation if you do it in a skillful way. And you want to also use internal folks. So the examples we saw from Boeing get the conversation started. The examples from the volunteerism effort were actually quasi-internal people who had experience with that brand or that agency, and then were telling their stories sort of as people on the inside, but telling that story as recruiters for folks that were on the outside. So I want to wrap up with some key takeaways, and I want to be mindful of the fact that I'm probably, number one, keeping you from the casino or an airplane. But the key takeaways here, so all this is really to make you think about taking all that advice and plugging it into where in the conversation are you? How can you empower your activities now, whether they're at a listening stage, a dialogue stage, or an advocacy stage? It seems trite to say, but you've got a network of folks that you've met here that are in this room that you've connected with over the last few days. Find out how they're doing this. Find out how they're having people tell their story. Find out what the impact has been. Those KPIs are great to apply to your business, but a better KPI is somebody who's trying to accomplish the same goal. Maybe they're even in a similar industry than you. What have they found success with? And what have they found failure with? Better to have somebody else fail fast and fail early than you. So adapt your mindset. This is a cultural shift. This requires training. This requires education. It's bi-directional up and down the power structure inside your organization. And be prepared for the fact that these are public conversations. They're not always going to go well. And understand that that's something that may sometimes negatively impact your brand, may negatively impact a campaign, but be mindful of the fact that it's something you can recover from and learn from and capitalize on. You want to harness the crowd, both internally in terms of building a model like Hub and Spoke that can scale out, that can get this level of social interaction across all your brands or all your products, but also harness the crowd outside your organization to do the work for you. And then think beyond marketing. This is a long-term process. The customer funnel, no matter how you decide it, starts with discovery and ends with post-purchase advocacy or post-purchase support. People should be getting engaged at every single one of those levels in the purchase funnel. This isn't about driving the sale of 15 more widgets. This is about doing that and making sure those widgets work and that that's a repeat customer. This is about that repeat customer advocating to somebody who's in the discovery part of the funnel, and you can use social at every stage. And lastly, you want to develop a strategy around business goals, because this is something that you need to measure in your own terms. KPIs are great. Number of followers is great. Advocacy is great. But if it isn't actually promoting what your business wants to accomplish, whether that stays in your hotel, whether that's number of units off the shelf, whether that's number of folks donating money. I just sat in a session where we talked all about how do you use mobile and social in the nonprofit sector. That may look very different if you're a nonprofit. You may be looking to engage 50,000 people for one cause on one day and then move on to the next. But there's still a way to measure that makes sense for your business. It may not be the same as the person next to you. It may not be the same as anybody else in the room. But if you understand that, you can take those KPIs, tweak them to your business, and apply them to what matters. So I want to thank you. We have some time for questions, and I'm going to skip by my slide here because credit where credit is due. This is research that was started by my colleague Jeremiah Aoyang. I mentioned that all of our Altimeter reports are available for free. They're under Creative Commons on our website. The full report about Career Path of the Social Strategist is there. It's available for download. It's a great read. We also talk about prioritizing social business budgets. And then there's a couple new reports that talk about those social business disasters. That's an interesting read, if nothing else. And some of the measurements and metrics. So a colleague of mine, Susan Ettlinger, does a lot of work on measurement and metrics of social programs that gets even deeper than the KPIs I put up here. So I want to shine the spotlight away from myself and on them because this is their brilliance, not mine, and I'm standing on their shoulders. So with that, Megan has a microphone.
Of course I have the microphone. Questions? We have to have at least one question. This is a great opportunity.
The question may be, when can we leave? We're tired.
No, no, you can't leave. If you don't ask any questions, no prizes get handed out. Come on, someone put your hand up. All right, yay, all right. Hold on a second, I'm coming.
A brave volunteer.
I don't like the microphone, but you had talked about going from a decentralized and trying to become more centralized and eventually a hub and spoke. I work for U-Haul and we have several programs and we are trying to figure out a way to get everybody to work together but still let the program managers manage their program via social. So do you have any suggestions on strategies to go from that decentralized to the hub and spoke?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things, and it's like a third or fourth bullet on one of these slides, but it's that idea of dialogue and that idea of bidirectional feedback, not the bidirectional training, but the spokes should be informing the hub about what works, and the spokes should be informing the hub about maybe what works for a given geographic market or a given segment of the business that U-Haul does, because it's a very tricky fine line that you walk in terms of setting a stage and setting a tone of the conversation, but then allowing that spoke to do what works best for it. So I think receptiveness there is part of the training that has to start from day one, and having that bidirectional exchange of information is important too. Experimentation within limits is good. If there's no room for experimentation in these programs, they're probably not going to do so well. If it's that to me is a sign of rigidity. So I keep using the Pinterest example just because every time I open my iPad, there's 5 more stories about it. But maybe there's an outlet that makes a lot of sense for a given business unit or a given geography. That isn't something that's even on the radar at the central hub, and that's something that is valuable to communicate and equally valuable for them to embrace. So I'd say that having those conversations, and if there's any rigidity there or those conversations start to seem unilateral, I mean, that's when you raise a hand and say, this isn't the way this is supposed to work.